Have sometimes, whether you have or not, and I think probably you have sometimes, it seemed to me, been preaching hate to meet hate.
I don't advocate any kind of hate.
But there's a lot of talk that sounds very much like it.
No, I think that the guilt complex of the American white man is so profound until when you begin to analyze the real condition of the black man in America, instead of the American white man eliminating the causes that create that condition, he tries to cover it up by accusing his accusers of people.
This is an interview they buried behind decades of slogans, textbooks, and whitewashed documentaries. One where Malcolm X didn't just criticize America, he accused it. He didn't call the United States racist, he called it criminal. In this interview, calm, clear, and precise, Malcolm lays out what no one else dared to say out loud, that what was happening to black Americans wasn't a civil rights issue. It was a human rights crime. But to what extent did he go that made them delete the interview? Let's get into it.
We believe that our problem is one not a violation of civil rights, but a violation of human rights. Not only are we denied the right to be a citizen in the United States, we're denied the right to be a human being.
To understand what Malcolm X exposed in this interview, you have to drop everything you've been taught about how America works. Every textbook, every speech, every pledge, all of it rests on one central illusion: that America was a good idea poisoned by bad individuals. That racism was a glitch, a few bad apples, a chapter, something we just had to evolve past. But that's not what Malcolm saw. What he describes, calmly without raising his voice, is something far more damning: that the entire system was built from the beginning to reduce black people into a permanent underclass. Not by accident, not by oversight, but by deliberate strategic design. This is not about slavery in the past. It's about how that same logic was repackaged after emancipation. The plantations became prisons. The overseers became police. The chains became policies. From housing and education to voting and employment, every institution was structured to limit movement, limit growth, and limit visibility. Malcolm isn't shocked by inequality. He expects it. He's not surprised that black Americans are poor, policed, and forgotten. He's saying that's the point. That's how the system knows it's working. What makes this interview so devastating is that he's not angry. He's analytical. He's a man laying out a diagram of oppression, like a mechanic showing you the blueprint of a machine that functions correctly, a machine that produces exactly what it was designed to: control. And here's the most dangerous part, the one that gets ignored in mainstream retellings of Malcolm's legacy. He doesn't blame individual racists. He doesn't waste time on people who use slurs or wave Confederate flags, because in his view, that's theater. The real problem isn't hatred, it's architecture. Nonviolence at its core is a powerful idea. It takes discipline, courage, and clarity of purpose. But in America, Malcolm saw something far more sinister taking shape. He saw nonviolence being transformed from a moral stance into a domestic public relations campaign. The United States didn't fear peace. It marketed it. It wrapped itself in it. As long as the resistance was quiet, controlled, and neatly televised, the system could keep functioning in the background, untouched. You could have marches. You could sing hymns. You could even get beaten in front of the cameras. Just don't ever cross the line into self-determination. This is what Malcolm understood better than anyone, that peace, when stripped of power, becomes performance. And performance is exactly what America needed to clean up its image while keeping its machinery running. Think about it. The government gives you a holiday for Martin Luther King, builds statues, names boulevards, but the very economic and political systems King fought against, still standing.
You've called people like Martin Luther King, who just got a Nobel Peace Prize, an Uncle Tom. Is this correct, first?
Well, I'd rather say that in the States, there's a law that has recently been passed, or a decision handed down by the court, wherein if you call someone an Uncle Tom, they can sue you for libel.
Well,
so I never refer to them as Uncle Toms. I would say that Uncle Martin is my friend.
Uncle Martin is your friend, yet you would disagree with his approach to what he wants to accomplish?
Definitely. If his approach would bring about what the black man in America needs to completely eliminate the problem that we have, I would say well and good. But I very much doubt that anyone who adopts the approach that Martin Luther King has been teaching to our people in that country can point to any meaningful gains that has actually served to solve the problem.
That's the trick Malcolm saw coming decades earlier. He warned that if the movement wasn't careful, it would become ceremonial, harmless, respected, but irrelevant. A museum piece, not a revolution. And the scariest part? It worked. By elevating peaceful protest as the correct way to resist, the system rewrote the rules of legitimacy. Now, if you shouted too loudly, you were aggressive. If you defended yourself, you were dangerous. If you rejected moderation, you were an insurgent. Nonviolence became a velvet leash. Malcolm's problem wasn't with peaceful people. His problem was with a power structure that only respected black voices when they posed no threat to white comfort. You could be heard, but only if you were soft. You could be seen, but only if you smiled. You could demand dignity, but only if you asked nicely. This is how America contained the movement without ever saying it was against it. They handed out awards. They televised marches. They met with protest with polite nods and legislative breadcrumbs. But the deeper systems, land theft, generational poverty, state violence, stolen labor, political exclusion, those remained untouched. Why? Because they weren't interested in change. They were invested in optics. And nothing served optics better than a black leader who condemned violence, even if violence was being used against his people. Because the world could look at America and say, see, they're evolving. Meanwhile, the numbers never changed. The jails stayed full, the schools stayed unequal, the banks stayed closed, and the police stayed brutal. That's what Malcolm meant when he dismissed symbolic peace. It wasn't about healing, it was about hiding. And let's be honest, it's still happening. Peaceful protests are praised as long as they're passive. But let a community speak without asking for permission? Let people refuse to turn the other cheek? Suddenly, they're out of control. Militant. Insurgents. That's the legacy of this tactic. A system that commits violence, then criminalizes any resistance that isn't performative.
To solve the problem.
Black Muslims have sometimes, whether you have or not, and I think probably you have sometimes, it seemed to me, been preaching hate to meet hate.
I don't advocate any kind of hate.
But there's a lot of talk that sounds very much like it.
No, I think that the guilt complex of the American white man is so profound until when you begin to analyze the real condition of the black man in America, instead of the American white man eliminating the causes that create that condition, he tries to cover it up by accusing his accusers of teaching hate. But actually, they're just exposing him for being responsible for what exists.
Well, that's something of an argument, but I've heard speeches made by some of the people of your group. I think I've heard you make speeches. It seemed to me that you were advocating what I would have to describe, I think, as violence to meet the serious injuries that have been done your people, with which I totally agree.
I don't call that violence. I don't in any way encourage black people to go out and initiate acts of aggression indiscriminately against whites. But I do believe that the black man in the United States and any human being, anywhere, is well within his right to do whatever is necessary, by any means necessary, to protect his life and property, especially in a country where the federal government itself has proven that it is either unable or unwilling to protect the lives and property.
Once you understand that America doesn't just manage oppression but packages it, you begin to see why it couldn't allow Malcolm X's next message to spread unchecked. Because Malcolm didn't just critique America's use of peace as propaganda, he directly challenged its monopoly on power. In America, resistance is only noble when it's powerless. But the moment that resistance refuses to die quietly, the moment it stops playing martyr, it becomes a threat. And Malcolm X understood that better than anyone. He didn't tell people to start riots. He didn't ask them to go hunting for vengeance. What he said was far more basic and far more radical. You do not have to let yourself be killed. This was not a call to arms. It was a call to dignity. Because in a society where black people were expected to absorb abuse, from police, from policy, from daily humiliations, even the suggestion of equal retaliation was treated like treason. That's why the media didn't report what Malcolm said. They reported how they felt about it. They didn't show the logic. They showed fear. And in doing so, they made self-defense look like aggression and turned survival into something dangerous. But Malcolm was drawing a line, a human one that exists across all cultures, all histories. The right to protect your life, your family, your property. America didn't deny that right to white people. It glorified it. From the Revolutionary War to the Second Amendment, American identity was built around self-defense. Farmers with muskets were heroes. Colonists who fought back were patriots. But when Malcolm said black people had the same rights, suddenly the rules changed. Why? Because the system had never prepared for the possibility that the people it dehumanized would refuse to stay in the box. Malcolm understood that you cannot teach a man he is fully human and then ask him to behave like a slave when danger arrives. You cannot preach equality and then recoil in horror when a black father decides his child's life is worth defending. The truth was simple. The lie was deliberate. Malcolm X didn't believe in violence. He believed in human worth, and he believed that worth deserved protection, even if the state refused to provide it. Especially when the state refused to provide it. Because when the law fails to protect you and the courts refuse to hear you and the police treat you like a suspect for breathing, what are you supposed to do? Pray? March? Wait? You protect yourself, not out of hatred, but out of responsibility. And that is why Malcolm became the enemy, not because he encouraged chaos, but because he encouraged clarity, because he shattered the illusion that peace is the highest virtue for the oppressed. For him, the highest virtue was survival. In this interview, his tone doesn't spike. He isn't shouting. He's stating the obvious, that the expectation of submission is itself an act of violence. That the denial of self-defense is a deeper kind of control, one that forces you to internalize your inferiority. He didn't teach black people to hate white people. He taught them to stop hating themselves long enough to protect what was theirs. That's not radical. That's normal. But in a society built on imbalance, normal becomes revolutionary when placed in black hands. And that's why this idea, simple, rational, and universal, had to be erased. Because it threatened the deepest lie of all, that safety belongs to some and silence to the rest. Here's a quick reminder, please like, share, and subscribe to Black Culture Unlocked for powerful black news, real stories of our heroes and leaders, and the rich culture and history the world tried to forget. By now you have followed Malcolm X through a path that exposes the structure of American injustice, its global containment strategy, its exploitation of nonviolence, and its manufactured panic around black self-defense. But in all of this, one critical shift remains to be explored: how Malcolm himself was transformed into a symbol of fear, not by what he did, but by what he represented. Because Malcolm didn't just speak, he refused to flinch, and that scared America more than any riot ever could. See, the system wasn't designed to eliminate every rebel. It was designed to absorb most of them and neutralize the rest through fear. Make them doubt, make them hesitate, offer them partial rewards if they fall in line, threaten them with poverty, exclusion, assassination of character, or worse. But Malcolm X was immune to that psychological campaign. That's what made him dangerous. He didn't wait for permission. He didn't water down his language to make white liberals more comfortable. He didn't ask how his message would play on television, and perhaps most fatally, he didn't fear what would happen to him if he told the truth. He was, in every way, post-illusion. And for the American system, that's an uncontainable threat. So what did they do? They turned him into a monster, not with facts, but with narrative. They built a character, a violent black man, angry, radical, anti-white, anti-America, dangerous. They ran his face through the same machine they used to process all threats. Criminalize, demonize, distort. They knew the people who would never listen to his speeches would still see his image. They knew those people didn't need proof to be afraid, just posture, just a headline, just the word insurgent next to his name. That's how perception becomes policy. And this strategy worked because America didn't need to prove Malcolm was violent. It just needed to convince enough people that he could be. Because once you do that, the system doesn't have to justify surveillance, censorship, or elimination. It just points to the monster it created and calls it a safety precaution. And let's be clear, this wasn't unique to Malcolm. This same system has used this blueprint for generations. It used it on the Black Panthers, on Marcus Garvey, on Fred Hampton. It uses it now on organizers, activists, and intellectuals who dare to speak with Malcolm's clarity. Malcolm didn't give them the image they used against him. They built it to neutralize what he was. Unshakable. And here's the deeper horror. By making him into a villain, they didn't just silence him in public, they isolated him in private. They made it harder for other black leaders to stand with him, harder for institutions to invite him, harder for the average person to listen without shame or fear. He became radioactive, not because of his words, but because of their distortion. This is how you erase a message without touching the microphone. But what makes this interview so unique and so explosive is that it catches Malcolm outside that frame. No anger, no shouting, just calm, razor-sharp analysis.
Those human beings.
Just before Pierre takes it, you've got a pretty good fighter and the world's heavyweight champion lined up with you to help out, yes.
And that's when the myth collapses. Because if Malcolm X isn't foaming at the mouth, if he isn't threatening violence, if he's just sitting there exposing the system, then the only thing scary about him is what he's saying. And that forces a new conclusion. He wasn't hated because he was violent. He was hated because he told the truth without blinking. And nothing is more dangerous to an empire than a man who's no longer afraid to speak plainly.
Then we're realizing that our problem in America, that we are black Americans, and we have a problem that goes beyond religion. We formed a group known as the Organization of Afro-American Unity. And the objective of this organization, it's non-religious, number one. Any Negro can belong to it. And the objective of that organization is to bring about a condition that will guarantee respect and recognition of the 22 million black Americans as human beings. We feel that the problem, number one, of the black man in America is beyond America's ability to solve. It's a human problem, not an American problem or a Negro problem. And as a human problem or a world problem, we feel that it should be taken out of the jurisdiction of the United States government and the United States courts and taken into the United Nations in the same manner that the problems of the black man in South Africa, Angola, and other parts of the world, and even the way they're trying to bring the problems of the Jews in Russia into the United Nations because of violation of human rights.
For decades, the U.S. positioned itself as the guardian of freedom, the defender of democracy, the world's last line of defense against tyranny. It pointed fingers at fascist regimes, communist dictatorships, and apartheid governments, lecturing them on justice, rights, and the rule of law. But what Malcolm X understood, and what he dared to say aloud, is that this entire image was a geopolitical con, a scam powered by military strength, media control, and the carefully orchestrated silencing of its internal contradictions. How could a nation preach liberation abroad while practicing dehumanization at home? How could it claim to be the shining city on a hill while black children were being locked in substandard schools, black men were hunted by police, black families were locked out of housing, and entire communities were segregated, surveilled, and starved? This was the contradiction Malcolm put front and center. He saw that America's greatest strength on the world stage wasn't its economy or its army. It was its image. That image had to be clean, heroic, and moral, and black suffering threatened to stain it permanently. So the strategy wasn't to fix the suffering, it was to hide it. This is why Malcolm's call to take the black American case to the United Nations was more than a clever tactic. It was an act of global sabotage, the kind of sabotage that could collapse an empire's reputation overnight. Because once the world understood that the U.S. was committing the same violations it accused others of, it would lose its moral leverage. its wars would be questioned, its treaties are doubted, its leadership is challenged, and the balance of global power would begin to shift. Malcolm understood the gravity of that move. He wasn't just making demands on behalf of Black Americans. He was pulling the curtain back on America's entire international persona. He was saying, this country doesn't get to be the world's referee when it can't follow its own rules. And here's the brilliance of his approach. He didn't do it with slogans or protests. He did it with logic, with legal language, with the same framework America used to condemn others. He forced the contradiction into the open. He said, if you support the Jews in Russia, why not the Black Americans in Alabama? If you condemn South Africa's racial caste system, what makes Mississippi any different? If you preach democracy, why do you assassinate your truth-tellers? These weren't rhetorical questions, they were indictments. And that's why this conversation, this calm and deadly interview, holds so much power even today. Because America still runs on that myth. It still wraps its wars, its markets, and its foreign policy in the language of human rights. But Malcolm showed us the foundation beneath that myth. And it wasn't justice. It was branding. It was the strategic erasure of Black pain in exchange for global prestige. And here's the most devastating part. The people he was trying to protect were being used as the evidence against themselves. Black Americans were trotted out as proof of progress whenever it suited the narrative, even while they were being crushed by the very state using their image. That's why Malcolm didn't want reform. He wanted exposure. Because once the world saw what was happening, it wouldn't be about race anymore. It would be about the law, about rights, about whether the global community was willing to hold its so-called leader to the same standards it demanded from others. He didn't want sympathy. He wanted a trial. And in this interview, he lays the groundwork for that trial. Not with fury, but with facts. Not with outrage, but with clarity. He saw that America's true fear wasn't rebellion. It was being seen.
Of himself. For a white man today, sir, after kidnapping millions of black people from Africa, stripping them of all human characteristics and relegating them to the role of chattel or cattle or animals, commodity, merchandise that could be bought and sold at will, and then 100 years since the Emancipation Proclamation, using every type of deceptive method to further us into slavery, called second-class citizenship, I think that it would take a whole lot of nerve for white people today to ask Negroes, do they hate?
Malcolm X didn't just say Black Americans were being denied rights. He said they were being denied existence, not in a physical sense. Black bodies were everywhere, in fields, factories, prisons, schools, and graveyards. No, Malcolm's point was deeper, more devastating. Black people weren't being treated as defective citizens, they were being treated as non-persons. And in the American system, that's not a glitch. That's part of the operating software. See, the U.S. Constitution begins with "We the people." But Malcolm understood that the entire history of Black life in America was about being systematically excluded from that definition, not just politically, but spiritually, culturally, and existentially. From slavery to segregation, from the 3/5 compromise to mass incarceration, Black identity had been constructed not as part of the American story, but as its foundation. The labor, the exploitation, the pain, all essential to building the country, but never enough to belong to it. And when Black people demanded inclusion, they weren't met with dialogue. They were met with suspicion, with surveillance, with silence, or with slogans, hollow, empty promises that dissolved under pressure. Malcolm saw this for what it was, not resistance to progress, but a refusal to even accept Black people as human beings with agency, with rights, with autonomy. That's why he didn't waste time asking for equality under someone else's definition. Because if the system is built on a false view of who counts as human, then asking for inclusion in that system only reinforces the lie. What's the point of civil rights if the government doesn't even see you as fully alive? That's the question Malcolm was asking, not directly, but through every frame of this interview, through every calm response, through every word that refused to bend to respectability politics. He wasn't looking to be accepted, he was asserting something more dangerous. I exist, whether you accept it or not, and I will defend that existence. This was the power of Malcolm's message, and this was the exact point where the American state recoiled, because if black people started seeing themselves as human without waiting for white validation, the entire racial hierarchy would begin to fall apart. That hierarchy depends on permission. It depends on the idea that your identity, your worth, and your future must be granted, not claimed. Malcolm rejected that dependency. He refused to wait for the courts, refused to wait for Congress, refused to wait for liberal approval. He took what every person is born with, the right to life, the right to self-definition, the right to protect what is sacred, and he said, "We are not asking any more." That shift, from seeking permission to declaring presence, is what made him revolutionary. It's also why he couldn't be co-opted. Most radical figures get softened over time. Their messages get polished, made safe for classrooms and coffee mugs. But Malcolm's core truth refuses to fade. He wasn't asking for rights as an American. He was demanding recognition as a human being. And that's a different war entirely. Because once you frame the issue that way, the entire debate about progress collapses. You're no longer arguing about policy tweaks or symbolic gestures. You're looking at a system and saying, "You were never meant to protect me, you were built to erase me." And once that truth is named, everything changes. You stop asking, you stop explaining, you stop apologizing for the volume of your voice, the anger in your tone, or the firmness in your stance. You stop begging to be seen. You start moving like you never needed to ask in the first place. That's what Malcolm X modeled, and that's what terrified the system. Because he didn't just call out injustice, he rejected invisibility, and in doing so, he redefined resistance itself.
No, I don't worry. I tell you, I'm a man who believed that I died 20 years ago, and I live like a man who is dead already. I have no fear whatsoever of anybody or anything.
In a world built on fear, fear of punishment, fear of loss, fear of being erased, Malcolm X became something rare and uncontainable, a man who had nothing left to fear. And that's when he became unstoppable. You can silence a man who wants money. You can buy off a man who wants power. You can threaten a man who's scared of dying. But what do you do with a man who's already accepted the cost? What do you do with someone who's already walked away from safety, from status, from every comfort the system offers in exchange for submission, and still keeps walking? That's what Malcolm X was. Not fearless in the reckless sense, fearless in the precise sense. A man who had already counted the cost, already faced the consequences, and chose truth anyway. By the time this interview happened, Malcolm had burned every bridge that protected him. He'd left the Nation of Islam, the only structure that gave him protection. He'd made enemies in the American state, in the media, and in law enforcement. He knew he was being watched. He knew his life was under threat. He knew some people wanted him dead, not because he was wrong, but because he refused to bow. And he kept speaking anyway. He didn't flinch. He didn't soften. He didn't hedge his words. He became even clearer. That clarity is what this interview captures. It's not rage. It's not despair. It's conviction. He sounds like a man who's already let go of the illusion that he'll grow old. He sounds like someone who's put everything in order, and now all that's left is the truth. You hear it when he speaks about the United Nations, when he calls for global recognition of black humanity, when he declares that self-defense is not violence. He calmly dismantles America's moral branding in front of a national audience. There's no performance, no PR, no calculation, just a man who has decided that fear is a cage and he will not live inside it. And that's what makes him terrifying to the system, because the entire American racial structure is built on fear, on intimidation, on making examples out of those who speak too boldly, on teaching people to look down before they speak up. Malcolm looked directly at the camera and never blinked. He was ready to call out everyone, from whites to black puppets.
And more than that, I would say that just because a person is a Negro or a black American does not mean there's going to struggle for Negro rights or for jobs for Negroes or anything else. I think that today you could point to a large number of Negro leaders who have consistently betrayed Negroes in a whole host of areas.
They aren't really Negro leaders. These are puppets that have been put in front of the Negro community by white liberals. These are parrots that have been put in front of the Negro community by white liberals. You can't name me a Negro leader who has been betrayed Negroes, who has not been endorsed, sanctioned, subsidized, and supported by the...
That's why they killed him. Because if one man can speak like that and survive, others will follow. If one man can face death and still speak the truth, the lie begins to crack. And if black people stop fearing what will happen if they demand more, the entire balance of power shifts. Malcolm X was many things: a father, a speaker, a Muslim, a strategist, a target. But above all, he was free. Not because the world gave him freedom, but because he refused to trade his soul for survival. And that kind of freedom, the kind that makes you speak anyway, march anyway, show up anyway, is the most dangerous force there is. They didn't fear Malcolm because he was violent. They feared him because he was unafraid. So what Malcolm X revealed in this interview wasn't just critique, it was structure. Calmly, with complete clarity, he pulled back the curtain on a system that didn't malfunction, but functioned exactly as it was built, to contain, control, and deny. He refused to frame the struggle as a request for civil rights. He reframed it entirely as a case of human rights violations committed in plain sight. The United States, he argued, wasn't a broken democracy trying to do better. It was a global power maintaining its image while quietly erasing those it never intended to include. He didn't speak as a victim. He spoke as a witness, a strategist, a man no longer asking to be seen, but demanding that the world stop looking away. That demand wasn't answered in his lifetime, and decades later it still hasn't been. But the evidence remains, his voice remains. And this interview, buried, ignored, quiet, now stands as testimony. Not to what he hoped would change, but to what he knew had to be exposed. The world still hasn't delivered a verdict. But Malcolm made sure the case could never be closed. Do you think they have been able to silence him? If the system hasn't changed, why are we still calling it progress? Let us know in the comment section. How long can the world ignore a case that was never closed? Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If so, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it, because here we tell the stories no one else will. From ancient African civilizations to modern black excellence, we reveal the truth, the power, and the legacy they tried to erase. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.